Namaskar and welcome to this conversation, this webinar on Ahimsa Conversations. First of all, my thanks to India International Center for providing this space for this gathering, and to Professor Ashis Nandy and Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo for their support and their presence here today. And thanks to all of you who are joining us as participants and listeners. We will start with a brief overview about Ahimsa Conversations. Then we will hear from Professor Nandy and Professor Jahanbegloo. At any time during these discussions, please feel free to place your questions in the chat box so that we will try to address as many as we can possibly in the limited time that there is in this 1 hour gathering. So to begin my story, Ahimsa Conversations is a YouTube channel that I launched on Gandhiji's Punya Tithi last year. Why Ahimsa and why conversations? Well, the word Ahimsa anchors the inquiry in India, and the word conversations declares the global intent of this. Ahimsa Conversations is one way of responding to the hatred and bitter polarization, which often appear like a tsunami that is threatening societies across the world. There is a need to affirm that conversations are the basis of our civilizational journey, and that Ahimsa is an endless striving and a living quest. There is a need to reaffirm this. For me, this journey began with a very basic question. What is the story of nonviolence after Gandhi? I already knew that even fairly well-informed people tend to believe that Ahimsa began and ended with Gandhiji. Many people also tend to think that Ahimsa in the political sphere can only be for a saint. On the other hand, we have political opposition to the idea of Ahimsa. It is claimed, still claimed, that the violence of the oppressed is justified and at times even necessary. And yet there is ample evidence to the contrary. In different corners of the world, from Latin America to India, I have found a wide range of people who are engaged in struggles for justice that are rooted in nonviolence. Yes, some of these strivings are driven by violence fatigue, as for example in Colombia, where a civil war raged for half a century. But most of the innovations in the practice of nonviolence seem to be driven by political and moral creativity, not by desperation. This is a validation of Gandhiji's confidence in Ahimsa. We know that Gandhiji died broken-hearted. The orgy of brutal communal violence from Noakhali to partition left Gandhiji with only one conclusion: that his experiment with Ahimsa as a form of political action had failed. And yet, even in that darkest hour, Gandhiji's confidence in nonviolence itself did not waver. His own failure was not the failure of Ahimsa. As Sudhir Chandra has said in his episode of Ahimsa Conversations, quoting Gandhiji, "Ahimsa kabhi diwaliya nahi ho sakti." However, the public discourse still remains focused on one very elementary question: is violence winning or is non-violence winning? And I suggest that this may be entirely the wrong question. Isn't it far more important to observe more and more closely how the striving for non-violence is alive, well, and even kicking? This is the impulse, the conviction that created in me the need, and it is a need, to listen to a wide range of voices, not just on and about nonviolence in practice and in theory, but on the dynamic between violence and nonviolence. Ahimsa Conversations, a weekly program, is just one expression of this impulse. At one level, this is quite simply an open source research. It's a form of open source research, because instead of quietly and privately conducting these conversations and many years later bringing them out as a book, I share the conversations on a public platform within weeks of their being recorded. And each video is released with a Creative Commons license so that it can be freely shared, replicated, copied, and used in educational programs or in the general discourse. By locating Ahimsa Conversations in the online space, I hope to appeal to the young who now spend a vast amount of their time in this realm, the online realm. As an activist endeavor, Ahimsa Conversations is firstly intended for those who are drawn to nonviolence but are at present feeling daunted about how it could be brought into action. This is because we live in a time when many things we earlier took for granted in public discourse and in politics, particularly common civility, the willingness to agree to disagree without rancor or a sense of enmity. These elementary assumptions are now often invalidated, or at least they are under threat in everyday life. In this situation, many who have lived by these values and who are drawn to nonviolence tend to see it, ahimsa, as a receding ideal, as an endangered value. So, Ahimsa Conversations is an effort to place on record that, on the contrary, many different forms of the striving for nonviolence are well and alive amongst us, and we need to know them more closely. This affirms, or rather reaffirms, the hope for a Samaj where there is unqualified dignity for all, unconditional dignity for all. And this is also an expression of faith in the possibilities of that which we cannot immediately see. Who is to say how many words or thoughts in these conversations could inform, inspire, and creatively provoke those who never otherwise thought much about nonviolence? Above all, Ahimsa Conversations builds upon the inspiration and the guidance of those who have kept the pathways lit by just traveling upon them, sometimes against all odds. So at the moment, as of last week, there are 45 such conversations that have been published with a wide range of activists, academics, philosophers, politicians, and business people. And here is now a brief montage of what some of these conversations have brought forth. Can we please screen the film now?
मनुष्य जन्मजात हिंसक प्रेरणा नहीं है, प्राणी नहीं है, वो अहिंसक प्राणी है।
क्योंकि दुनिया चल रही है, ये प्रूफ है इस बात का कि मेजॉरिटी जो लोग हैं हर कम्युनिटी के, वो नॉन वायलेंट हैं।
वही अहिंसा परम धर्म है जो सत्य पे आधारित है। जो भय पे आधारित है वो अहिंसा नहीं है।
Synthesis of views, synthesis of civilization, synthesis of cultures, synthesis of religious ideas is the material of non-violence.
इंसानों के लिए बेचैन रहना, ये कहीं ना कहीं अहिंसा है।
There is no creation of democracy without non-violence.
हमला चाहे जैसे होगा, हाथ हमारा नहीं उठेगा। हिंसा से हिंसा खत्म नहीं हो सकती।
अगर हिंसक आंदोलन होता तो लोगों की हिम्मत उतनी नहीं होती जितनी मैंने उसमें देखी।
The nonviolent peace forces roots are deeply rooted in the Gandhian idea of the Shanti Sena. That conflict, disagreement is absolutely inevitable. Violence does not have to be.
अहिंसा दिवालिया कभी नहीं हो सकती।
अन्याय और गैर बराबरी के विरोध में हम लोग अहिंसा से प्रेरित होकर ही कार्यरत रहे।
और किसी सत्ताधीश के सामने आप निडरता से खड़े रहते हो, हम नहीं डरेंगे, वो उनको डरा सबसे ज्यादा डराने वाली बात होती।
Hurt people hurt people. So I know, although our pain is not equal, I know that that white supremacist has something painful in their past. It's not an excuse. It's just a discovery. And I think if we can hang in the conversations and discover that, you can move all sorts of things.
अहिंसक राजनीति की प्रवृत्ति वापस देश में लानी, उसके लिए कहानियां, नैरेटिव्स, और उसके लिए प्रक्रियाएं, प्रोसेसेस पॉलिटिक्स में हमें वापस लाना पड़ेगा। अहिंसा के रास्ते का कैंप का अहमियत, सबसे बड़ा अहमियत वैलिडेशन।
The story of nonviolence after Gandhi is deeper and richer than is commonly known. Ahimsa Conversations are an invitation to reflect on the ongoing innovations in the striving for nonviolence. I will now invite Professor Nandy and welcome also Professor Jahanbegloo, both of you. Thank you so much for being here. So Professor Nandy is a globally renowned political psychologist, but for me, he has been a mentor, a guide, and inspiration. I personally cannot imagine either my political or intellectual life without his influence. So Professor Nandy, in the mid-1980s, you were part of an international group of scientists and sociologists who drafted the Seville Statement on Violence, which later was adopted by UNESCO. And this statement was based on a wide range of multidisciplinary work, which showed that violence is not more natural to humans than non-violence. Has this approach expanded and grown over the last, what now it is almost 35 years, 35 years? And how would you locate the endeavor of Ahimsa Conversations in that larger context?
Well, frankly, we were concerned not as much with violence proper as with war. The Seville Statement, in fact, insists that war is not something natural to human beings. That that particular position has now been further strengthened by works like that of Widen, who has written a history of war, and which shows that wars entered human society only after a few million years after human beings began to inhabit the whole earth. So it entered the society as a custom, and it has proved to be a terribly sticky custom, in that most people think that it is natural and normal for wars to take place, and we should be always prepared for wars, because there are people lurking all around the horizon who are will take advantage of your weakness to launch a war on you. So in that sense, what you are saying is right, but this has to be remembered that both violence and non-violence are, I would like to say, equally balanced, because both are instinctive to human beings. Violence as opposed to love. Violence which is wedded to the affirmation of death is thanatos. And love as a part of life, affirmation of life, is eros. And I think the dialectics between the two define us. It is not necessary to us to define which is stronger, because both are motives, human motives. These qualities are given to us for not only survival of the individual, but also species. But there is a tendency, as you rightly point out, to emphasize the power of violence as opposed to the power of love. And that, I think, is not correct. in our study of partition violence, with which you are associated, Rajni, to some extent you know about it, we found that as many as 40% of the people we interviewed had either benefited directly or heard of others being benefited by the other side. The site, as you know, it was a communal conflict. So if you were a Hindu and the mobs attacking you were Muslim, you nonetheless found amongst the Muslims people who helped you to escape, or people who defended you, or people even laid down their lives for you. And if you were a Muslim and were victim of a Hindu onslaught, you had the same kind of help from amongst the Hindus. My friend Salim Ahmed of Pakistan prepared 100 case studies of Muslim refugees who ran away to Pakistan, and remembered with great fondness the way they were helped by Hindus when the Hindu mobs attacked them. Similarly, we found in our studies many examples of that kind of resistance to violence. Violence also comes naturally to human beings. Nobody has to teach a mother to love her child, and nobody has to teach human beings to hate also. But somehow or other, as a part of our developmental experience, we learn to acquire enemies and learn to acquire allies. This is not my proposal or hypothesis. This is Vamik Balkan's, the Turkish psychoanalyst, who says that this is a part of our developmental process, that we have enemies and allies, and we organize our lives around them. But it is our responsibility, I feel, not to forget the strength of the instinct to love, which expresses itself as non-violence. Non-violence springs from the belief that life forces, the affirmation of life, is more important than affirmation of death. And this is the message of the Seville statement too.
Thank you so much, Professor Nandy, for your opening remarks. Or would you like to continue?
No, I would just like to point out one more issue which will probably come up in our discussion. I want to suggest to you that we have associated Ahimsa, non-violence, with Gandhi's name. But strangely enough, there are works which show that some years before Gandhi entered the Indian public life, before anybody in India had heard of Gandhi, except for a few who kept in touch with South African events, there was in the air a kind of a feeling that India needed somebody like Gandhi. The best example of this are some works of Tagore, poetry, plays, and novels, where the character of Gandhi is anticipated. And the finest expression of this is in his novel Gora, where he locates Gandhi and Savarkar both without knowing their significance or without knowing their background and ideologies. And this is almost uncanny that he does so. And so what I am trying to suggest to you is this, that it is not only within us to choose between violence and non-violence. There is in our upbringings, in our cultural values, a certain base for non-violence, certain base for resisting of violence, particularly surplus violence of the kind which has become a hallmark of the 20th century. You know, the wars are no longer only wars, they are total wars. And all wars now tend to become total. Even small wars between small countries tend to become total wars. And there is a certain brutalization in the air. It is that brutalization which has to be particular for. A tiger also is aggressive, but it doesn't kill for sport. It kills for survival mostly.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We will come back to some of these questions in the discussion we'll have. Can I now invite Professor Jahanbegloo to please share with us his thoughts? Professor Jahanbegloo is a globally renowned political philosopher, and at present he's the executive director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies at Jindal University. Professor Jahanbegloo.
Thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, let me thank you, Rajni, and thank India International Center. Also, I'm very happy to share this panel with my dearest friend, Ashis. To answer your question, let me start like this. I think that, to speak like Victor Hugo, I would say that nonviolence is an idea whose time has come. So despite all the violence that we see around the world, and we are actually, our present world is gripped with everyday violence that we see, not only wars and conflicts, but also individual violence and people shooting each other, and a lot of difference, and of course poverty and economic problems are also part of violence. I think that nonviolence can still offer humanity not only what we can call a philosophy of life, but also an art of organizing the human society. Why do I say that? Because I think that we live in a world of mediocrity and insanity, and nonviolence, I think, should become a new manner for us of mind. It would help us to think otherwise. It helps us to think otherwise about our world, about ourselves. Nonviolence is the reminder of the noblest and the most decent that survives in human beings under the greatest evils that we have. So all these aspects are very important. We're talking about politics, and we're talking about economy, and the social problems. These are all experiments, I would say, what Gandhiji called experiments with truth, which happen not in private life only, but in the public space. And because there is no such thing as armchair nonviolence. You cannot sit in your chair and say, I'm nonviolent and I believe in nonviolence. You have to go and struggle and be active. So we need to invest in nonviolence as a moral and political value, as we invest today for saving the environment in the same form of investment, I would say. And in that sense, I think that Gandhi, like Henry David Thoreau, like Tolstoy, like many others, he believed that nonviolence is mostly the work of civil societies rather than the states. And we see that the states around the world, even democratic states, I'm not talking about the dictatorial states, even democratic states, liberal states, they don't do much for nonviolence if nonviolent activists, if global civil actors, civic actors around the world, they will not intervene for the environment, for the poor, for the equality, for social equality. So these aspects are very, very important to understand. Something which adds to this, since I said that nonviolence for me is the art of organizing the society and organizing the society nonviolently. Nonviolence, if we call it a nonviolent revolution, I would say revolution in the sense that you make changes. Nonviolent revolution is what Martin Luther King Jr. called a revolution of values. So values become very, very important when we're talking about nonviolence. So as you see, I take the existential side and moral side of nonviolence, which has always been there since Jesus Christ, Mahavira, the Buddha, and then we have it later on in Christianity with Saint Francis. We have it in 20th century with Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Mandela. All these aspects are very, very important. But what nonviolence, why is this so important that we're still talking about nonviolence? It's about interconnectedness. Interconnectedness between human beings, but between us and other living creatures, plants, animals, how we respect them. So the two concepts which comes to my mind when we talk about nonviolence is respect and responsibility. Very, very important. We are talking about the compassion, as we talk about compassion in many religions, but as you know, people like MLK Jr. and Gandhi also talk all the time about love and compassion. Tolstoy talks about love and compassion. So compassion is very, very important. But we have also, because without compassion, we will not certainly, as Ashis was saying, this aspect, psychological aspect, instinct of love, which is so important, or call it art of loving in human beings, becomes so important. We will not believe in empowering the weakest if we do not have this instinct of love, or we do not try to invest this instinct of love. Look at where we are in today's world. We are in a post-pandemic world. A world of fragility, a world of frailty, a world which shows that individuals can suffer, they can lose their jobs, they have a lot of weaknesses, they have social weaknesses, political weaknesses, economic weaknesses. And what can we do for these powerless people? Well, it's by empowering them. I mean, I would speak like Havel, Václav Havel, the late president of the Czech Republic. As you know, he wrote a piece which called the power of the powerless. Nonviolence actually empowers the powerless. Now, it does it in two senses, which I think we're going to discuss with people who are listening to us or watching us. One is the transition from dictatorships to more liberal sense of politics, or let's say democracies. One is like what we do in India and elsewhere, United States, France, Germany, is to democratize democracies. Nonviolence helps us, without the use of violence, to be more responsible citizenry, to understand how to democratize our democracies, to change our democracies, to bring, as we say among Gandhians, to bring ethics into politics, and also to use this Gandhian legacy of compassionate, I would say, solidarity and empathy somehow to make our world a better world. So altogether, to answer your question, I think nonviolence is not a sprint. Nonviolence is a marathon. It takes time. You know, if we are in a hurry, it's better to leave it and go back home. You cannot be a nonviolent activist. You cannot be a nonviolent thinker if you want to be a corporate lawyer, and if you want to have money immediately and you want to have success immediately. Idea of success in nonviolence is a moral success more than just political success of being elected in the elections or winning. I think so. It's important to have this patience and this moral preparedness.
Thank you so much. That is actually a point that many of the speakers have made, that without patience, in fact, almost as though patience is a quality of nonviolence. But I just wanted to ask both of you to respond, or rather to expand on something that I've heard you both talk about, but I think the audience would find that very valuable, because you have, both of you, a critique of modernity itself. And we live in a time of great paradox. On the one side, we have, for the first time in human history, a Charter of Human Rights. And, you know, we have some kind of a sanction for the idea that might is not right. But at the same time, we are seeing a deepening and a worsening of everyday violence. One of the questions that has just appeared is, how would we respond to the fact that, for example, domestic violence has escalated very dramatically during the pandemic and the lockdowns? But that's just one example. Professor Nandy, would you like to say something first on what is currently your vision of how we may contend with the inherent violence that modernity has brought?
I do not know how far it is inherent to modernity, but it has picked up the baggage of violence and turned it into a multinational, almost corporatized venture. This has gone along with a kind of a reification of values, which are very thin, and the commitment to values, though we speak of it all the time, nonetheless is skin deep and usually an attempt to conform to a certain kind of social norms. There is no intrinsic commitment either to nonviolence. In fact, I would say there is only intrinsic commitment to a kind of violence which is waiting to express itself. Often, the violence comes before the target, in the sense that you seek to be violent, you seek to precipitate a war before you find a target or before you find a proper enemy to do so. Because there is advantages of various kinds. By precipitating a war, for example, you can unify a country behind yourself if you are a leader. Similarly, by threatening war, you can subdue or solve the claims of a smaller neighbor who cannot fight with you. So on and so forth. So war as a political weapon and nonviolence as a resistance to it also has a different set of functions in our times. It is not only that we are satisfying our inner values when we fight non-violently. We are actually confirming to an inner expectation in a larger human sorority, if I can call it so, that we might succeed where through non-violent ways more than violent ways. And there is on the other side, there are people who would rather not succeed in a non-violent way. They would rather fail in a violent fashion and become a hero rather than become non-violent and succeed. Look at our heroes in recent years. I think the upper echelons of our list of heroes, our icons, human icons, are basically non-violent. Not only Gandhi, but Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa,
Dalai Lama,
Nelson Mandela, till recently Aung San Suu Kyi, and so on and so forth. These are our new heroes. I'm glad that Ramin mentioned Václav Havel.
Yeah.
He didn't start with a Gandhian agenda. He arrived at it. Nor did Gomulka, the Polish trade unionist, that vodka guzzling, mustachioed union leader, and not read a word of Gandhi, but nonetheless arrived. And people started calling him our Gandhi in Poland. Similarly with Aquino in Philippines.
That's right.
Same thing. He was very much a classical liberal. He had not read Gandhi, but he came to Gandhi when people started calling him Aquino our Gandhi. That was the poster they used. So there is in the air a certain need for Gandhi, of a Gandhi-like figure. Gandhi was an accident in that sense, that he came to symbolize what we were probably looking forward after the two world wars, after the enormous killings of the genocide in 20th century. If I'm not wrong, it is something like 225 million people killed in genocides. So there was a thirst for somebody like Gandhi. The thirst for somebody like even Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela didn't start as a Gandhian. So this part of the story we have not really tapped. We think that nonviolence belongs to those who are ideologically committed to it and willing to take a position on that and willing to sacrifice something for it. I think nonviolence is a more widely shared inner self of ours. And even those who hate nonviolence as some kind of a superstition, that's the term Savarkar used. That is anti-scientific and superstitious, non-violence and fasting as political weapons. But there was behind that dismissive statement, a fear that it will overtake him, it will undermine his view. And it did happen that way. Savarkar died a frustrated man, though he has made a posthumous re-entry into Indian politics, but that's a different story. So there is this part of the modernity which we have not really examined closely. This kind of a latent thirst, latent thirst for and thirst for both a non-violent public life. And there is underlying that thrust a fear that we are living in times when violence has failed and continues to fail in solving virtually any basic problem of humankind.
Yeah.
Just example, if you want, I can say that the British implemented 4 partitions. Because it was a very, I would say, ultra-positivist solution, and which sounds very reasonable. If 2 communities are in conflict and quarreling repeatedly, then best is to give them 2 nations, 2 nation states, and they should live. They will be able to live peacefully ever since. The first partition that it introduced was in Ireland. It began in the first decade of 20th century. The violence went on till the first decade of 21st century. Cyprus was a small island. They partitioned that next. And the violence went on 40 or 50 years. They got tired. This being a small island, ultimately it subsided almost the kind of a both sides gave up. They were tired of the violence. Then came the last 2, Palestine and India, South Asia, South India. And both are bleeding still. So in some sense, even a simple thing like that can illustrate beautifully the limits of violence in our times.
At the same time, when you see something like the Extinction Rebellion, which actually validates and it manifests all that Ashishta has just said about our longing for the nonviolent approach. And if you remember, this is only 2 years ago, they brought London to a standstill for so many days at a stretch, and with not a single act of violence happening. So that's an amazing feat for such a large volume of very diverse people to maintain that kind of discipline. And yet, Ramin, what I ask you is, how do we see, how do we project this into the future? Because what the Extinction Rebellion is opposing, the structural violence that is bringing upon us a planetary catastrophe. Do you see how does this kind of energy move political economy on a planetary scale? Or is it that these are small steps and we should keep the faith and somewhere it will all add up?
No, I think that your question is very much related. I mean, the second question is very much related to the first question. And what Ashishta said, the first question was about modernity. And now you're questioning about our future. When we're talking about modernity, and actually I would say immediately that Gandhi was a modern person, and he understood. I mean, when we read Hind Swaraj, we see that he understood very well the essence of modernity. In modernity, we always had 2 concepts. We had 2 principles which contradicted each other, and we were always in conflict with each other. One is the concept of domination and conquest that we see in imperialism, in colonialism, in the conquest of nature, the Cartesian project of being masters and possessors of nature. We see it in modern science and modern technoscience, what we can call it the technoscience, and of course modern philosophy. The second aspect, which nonviolence is also, and nonviolent struggle has been part of it, is the concept of emancipation. Modernity helped the emancipation of women. It brought human rights, Declaration of Human Rights. We had American Revolution. We had French Revolution. We have had democracies, modern democracies, representative democracies. So these are also fruits of the modernity. And how do we situate nonviolence in between? Look at Hind Swaraj. Hind Swaraj is actually Gandhi coming and talking about nonviolence as a civilizing process. and opposing it to the civilizing process of the modern civilizing process, or let's say the Western one, which is, according to him, has become very immoral and based on the fact of, has become what we call, or I call in my book, Decline of Civilization, decivilizing process, which is based on the idea of utility with the utilitarian philosophy. Now, in what is so important for us today when we're talking about nonviolent struggle and empowering the weak and the problem, how to solve our environmental problem, how to solve the problems, the social problems, the economic problems. I think that when we're talking about empowering the powerless and going back and trying to use actually nonviolent principles, is not to have this idea of conquest of the world anymore, not to have the idea of the conquest of the planet Earth, and the way we are dealing with nature. This is actually, I think, what is important in our post-pandemic world. If there is one thing that the pandemic world, the pandemic experience should have taught us, is the art of living and art of dying, which we have completely lost. Nonviolence as a doctrine, as a philosophy, is a mode of questioning. It should tell us that modernity is also about a philosophy of questioning, and philosophy of questioning means dissent. We actually today talk about dissent as a form of just being opponents to a political regime. That's not it. Dissent means questioning, and nonviolence as a form of dissent means that we have not lost this Socratic art of questioning, which is actually the moral courage that all nonviolent thinkers are talking about. So the most important part of it, which is modern, and Gandhi actually, and Martin Luther King, and Tolstoy, and Henry David Thoreau, and many others talked about it, either in 19th century, 20th century, and now in 21st century, we need to talk about it, is what the German philosopher Immanuel Kant called exit from our immaturity, how we become mature. To talk about nonviolence in a world where we had Donald Trumps and we have had so many, as Ashis said, so many genocides in Rwanda, in ex-Yugoslavia. It started with the Armenian genocide, and we had Auschwitz and many others, is that humanity has to become mature, morally mature, intellectually mature, philosophically mature, psychologically mature. And part of this maturity is that people try to question why they are living the way they are living. Why do they, for example, why do we have so many populist regimes around the world? Why do they go and vote for somebody like Orban in Hungary? Why do they vote for Erdogan in Turkey? Why do they accept populism in India or any other places? So there is an imperative, which is actually intellectual, philosophical imperative, but also at the same time an ethical imperative to democratize our democracies, to ask questions, to somehow, I would say, to go against this arrogant epistemology, which is part of the modern, I would say, canon, which says, I have the truth, and this is exactly what technoscience is doing today, and what corporate mindset is doing today. It's doing it everywhere, even in the academia, coming and saying, we make you successful people. But what does it mean to be successful? I mean, the question you're asking me, what does it mean to be successful when you're telling a young man or a young woman of 25 that you will be successful if you go through this road? This is not exactly teaching that person what the Greeks called paideia, meaning that you have this education, which is also a moral education, and it also helps you to interconnect with the world, and to have this, what Martin Luther King beautifully calls cosmic friendship, to have this cosmic friendship, which we have totally lost. So the task of somebody like me as a philosopher who believes in nonviolence is to write more and more and teach more and more about this cosmic friendship, and also about how to get out of the spirit of conquest, which destroyed civilizations like the Maya and Aztec civilization, by the conquest of Americas, how it turned into partitions and genocides, and how it actually leaves people very immature and does not help them to get to a maturity, intellectual maturity and a philosophical maturity.
Thank you so much, Professor Jahanbegloo. We have actually two very different and very interesting questions. If you don't mind, I'll read out both and I'll leave it to you to decide which one you wish to address. One is from Ankit Singh from Polachi. He says, can the coming age of artificial intelligence produce a new perspective on nonviolence? How is AI going to impact power devolution in society? Or will AI take place of civil societies as distinct social institutions? And then we have Rukmini Bhaya Nair asking that she says that we've mentioned Martin Luther King as saying that nonviolence may become the answer to the most desperate need of all humanity. So Rukmini's question is, can the members of the panel say specifically what they view as this most desperate need of humanity today? Or is there a hierarchy of such needs, what these may be?
Fish or me?
Sorry?
Let Ramin.
Okay, I can go. I can go first.
Please go.
Let Ramin give a response first.
Yes.
Sure.
First of all, about artificial intelligence. I think that, again, I go back to what I was saying about, this epistemological arrogance of technoscience, which is to come and say, we solve all the problems, we can save you from everything, and there is no need to think more and or have this what we can call this epistemic humility towards other manners of living, other manners of thinking, towards nature, towards other living beings, because we are the conquerors of truth and the last truths. And that is actually positivistic and sciences, and this is utilitarian way of looking at life, which we have in the corporate mindset today. Now, does I will ask the question from the person who is watching us and ask this question. Does AI, does artificial intelligence, is it possible? I mean, we know that we can make robots. We know that we can have computers who can play chess and beat somebody like Kasparov. But is it possible for artificial intelligence to create, to give us the sense of beauty that we find when we listen to the Requiem of Mozart, or we listen to Gustav Mahler, or when we watched Chapel 16 of Michelangelo? It's practically impossible, because that's also part of the good side of human nature, as Ashis was talking about when he talked about instinct of love and compassion. These are all parts of human beings that machines cannot create. It's an absolute, I would say, nonsense to think that future technologies can give us a life which is a moral life and a life full of beauty and full of compassion. They will not do that. It's going to be exactly the opposite. I'm not trying to make a science fiction out of it. I'm trying to be very realistic. And the problem is that, and that goes to the second question of the person I'm answering. The question is, that the most desperate thing that we have because of the life that we're having is to become more mature and to have this questioning, to ask ourselves questions that we do not ask when in the morning we get up and we're having our breakfast. We do not ask ourselves questions about the world in which we're living. We take it for granted. And taking for granted the violence of our world, taking for granted the nonsense of our world, the mediocrity and insanity of our world will not help us. The first move, I would say, towards a nonviolent philosophy is to ask permanent questions about why we are living the way we are doing it and why we are unable to educate future generations to be good human beings and to be moral human beings, because that has been completely lost. I mean, one of the failures of 21st century is the education of future generations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ashishta?
Artificial intelligence is a growing science, but futurists and science fiction writers had tried to anticipate it. And if you look at the kind of works, say for instance, Isaac Asimov has done in his novels, there are these iron laws of robotics, which kind of represents the ethics which the robots have to live by or survive by. It is built into them. But as Ramin pointed out, that this does not come from human passions. It's not backed by human passion. It is backed by sophisticated machines. And to the extent that machine is accessible to persons who do not share that ethics and might like to have a shortcut by taking a recourse to violence, that shortcut will be taken. There are novels and movies which exactly depict that kind of a problem. So in a movie like Avatar, you are actually running away from the earth. You give up on the earth because earth is now unlivable, and you go and colonize another planet which rich in natural resources. And the consequences are also very clear in the movie. Avatar at least ends not with pessimism, but some degree of optimism that the army which tries to invade is ultimately thrown back. They have to go back to Earth. Now, I am giving this example because I see also in other science fiction writers, like Michio Kaku, a very well-known physicist who writes science fiction, and I find many writings of futurists that one of the main concerns of them is how to live the earth and inhabit other livable planets, or turn them into livable planets. I think this is absurd. If you could not maintain a planet in which we have lived for at least 6 million years, 6 to 8 million years is estimated human existence on planet Earth, it is unlikely that in a quick fix in some other planet will make you better and make you behave better. You will devastate that planet also, and it will be the total waste of human effort and a false trail which leads nowhere. I have the suspicion that we have to ultimately learn to live with the earth and live with the human beings we have. And I think willy-nilly, ultimately, those who believe in nonviolence, let us put it a more positive way, because nonviolence means, then in nonviolence, the word ahimsa comes from Sanskrit. It's a Sanskrit word. Indian philosophy uses it. There is the assumption that if a word is a negation of a characteristic, ahimsa, negation of hingsa, then hingsa is the natural tendency of human beings. Ahimsa you have to learn or cultivate. So it's very interesting. I mean, this is so. This is the way the language has developed, and I have a feeling that human beings are capable of learning Ahimsa too. The widespread weakness for Ahimsa. Only a few years ago, they used to make fun of it. Many people told me, I have heard this myself in my long life, that if a leadership like the Nazi leadership of Germany, Nazis would have laughed and joked about Gandhi and his Ahimsa, and actually one his history of Second World War mentions this. What kind of they sarcastically called Gandhi's charkha a prayer wheel. Gandhi and his prayer wheel. They made fun of it. The fact of the matter is this, that nonviolence was used against Nazi Germany only once. Only once. And it succeeded. Because German women protested against the incarceration of their husbands, who would have been probably liquidated. But they were so afraid of that huge collection of women demonstrating right in Berlin against the Nazi regime, and demanding the release of their husbands. And they won. They won. So there is possibilities open to us, but we have been socialized not to look at them. There is something drastically wrong with our diplomacy, our concept of foreign relations, our concept of negotiations. So I think because it is seen as a world of where fully determined by a bargaining model, which you see in the corporate world, is transferred to the diplomatic world. But I think there are other alternatives too within this world also. Somebody once told me, not told me, I mean, she presented the paper. She observed that in diplomatic exchanges, particularly when you are discussing what should be done, you always got always you will be taken more seriously if the first instinct is to say, we should go and attack them. We should nuke the bastards. And then if you say that, okay, on second thoughts, I think we can perhaps do with some pressure and so on and so forth, then your non-violent gesture may be taken more seriously than if you at the beginning say, let us try and avoid war. Then you are seen as a weakling and not a proper diplomat, not a proper policy advisor, and so on and so forth. That whole culture is masculine. The whole culture is tinged in aggression and violence, and the whole training is how to handle this in terms of arms, army, and defense.
Thank you, Ashis. I think we've run out of time. Actually, we've overrun by about 4 minutes, but it's been so rich, and I'm sorry we couldn't address all the questions. There were a few more questions in the chat box. So again, a big thanks to both of you and to Teti and the program team at IIC for enabling us to do this. And Ahimsa Conversations will continue. I intend to keep doing them this coming year. And so if nothing else, at least it'll be a space in which I think we'll continue to explore these and other questions. And I hope to bring forward more and more voices of the kind that maybe have not always been heard as much. So thank you so much to all.
Thank
And
you.
good night. Namaste.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Namaste.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.